Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. A confidential human source for the FBI was arrested last week for allegedly making false statements about Ukrainian energy company Burisma and Joe and Hunter Biden. The source, a man called Alexander Smirnov, had told the FBI in 2020 that Joe and Hunter Biden each received a $5 million bribe from the owner of Burisma in exchange for protection from an investigation into Burisma by the then Ukrainian chief prosecutor Viktor Shokin. The charges were brought by special counsel David Wise, the man who recently charged Hunter Biden with tax offenses. What immediately jumps out is that while Smirnov has been charged with allegedly lying to the FBI about the Bidens, all the people who lied to the FBI about Donald Trump have gotten off scot-free. We'll go through that list. We'll also look into what might happen next, because if Smirnov does not take a deal and instead takes this to trial, we're going to find out a lot more about the Bidens' entanglements with Burisma, especially since there's evidence that Smirnov knew more than special counsel Wise now claims. The basic outlines of the Biden corruption story are well known. After Joe Biden became the unofficial viceroy of Ukraine in early 2014, that means to say after President Obama put Biden in charge of Ukraine, Hunter immediately started to cash in. Starting in 2014, Ukrainian energy company Burisma paid Hunter $1 million a year for a no-show job, and even though Hunter knew nothing about energy or Ukraine. And then in 2015, the chief prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, started investigating Burisma, and as part of that investigation, he seized the property of Burisma's owner, Mykolai Zlochevsky. Joe Biden, as vice president, then leveraged a $1 billion loan guarantee to force the Ukrainian president to fire that chief prosecutor, Viktor Shokin. Biden admitted that on tape. And it is also known that Joe Biden did this shortly after the head of Burisma's board, a man called Vadim Podjarski, demanded from Hunter Biden that prosecutor Shokin's investigations into Burisma needed to end. Those are the confirmed facts. What was not known, and what remains unknown, is whether the Bidens received any additional money for getting the prosecutor fired. There are some suggestions that some kind of money laundering was going on, but we only know this indirectly because at the exact same time that the prosecutor was fired, Latvian authorities were looking into Hunter Biden for suspected money laundering. So when Alexander Smirnov, the FBI's confidential human source who is now being arrested, well, when he came forward, it sounded at least possible that the Bidens did get some extra money. But, and this is the crucial part, it did not in any way change the underlying story, which, as we just saw, is that Joe Biden fired the prosecutor who was investigating his son's firm. That's the main story, and that's confirmed. The only question is whether the Bidens got paid to do that. Smirnov claims that he heard from a Burisma official that Joe and Hunter Biden got $5 million each for protecting Burisma from prosecutor Shokin. Smirnov was allegedly told this in late 2015-16 during the Obama-Biden administration when he first met with a Burisma official. Special counsel David Wise now claims that Smirnov could not have heard that because he had talked to the Burisma official for the first time in 2017 and not in late 2015 or 16. But there's at least one big problem with Wise's allegation. In his June 2020 testimony to the FBI, Smirnov said that Biden was known as the big guy. That information did not become public until October of 2020 when Biden associate Tony Bobulinski came forward. So Smirnov, who had been known as a reliable source, must have had insider knowledge. On the other hand, there's also evidence that might suggest that Smirnov embellished. That's because he started telling the FBI about Burisma in 2017, but he did not tell them about the bribe until 2020. Maybe he was upset about Trump getting impeached for merely asking for an investigation into Biden corruption. Maybe, like us, he knew that shady things were going on and wanted to help things along a bit. We don't know why he said what he said, but let's just assume that he did not know that a bribe was paid, but said it anyway. Does that change the underlying story? No. We still have Hunter being paid millions of dollars despite not having any expertise of any kind. We still have Joe Biden firing the prosecutor, indeed single-handedly changing US government policy to do so, as we discussed on a recent show. And we still have money laundering allegations. What the story does is that it detracts from and damages the known parts of the story. New York Times readers will assume that if the $5 million story is not true, then none of the Biden corruption stuff is true. So in that way, Smirnov achieved the exact opposite of what he set out to do, if indeed he did set out to try and catalyze an investigation into Biden corruption. But while the Smirnov arrest does not change the fact of what the Bidens did, it does throw up some very serious questions about selective prosecutions. We know from the Trump-Russia collusion hoax that confidential human sources make stuff up all the time. But for some reason, the fake sources in the Trump-Russia collusion scam got away with everything while Smirnov is being charged. That ought to be the real story here. Let's go through the list. The most egregious example is probably infamous dossier author Christopher Steele. He was a confidential human source for the FBI, and his dossier was almost entirely made up. In fact, the only part that was not made up was info that was publicly available anyway.
The Steele dossier was entered in the congressional record. Was it true?
I'm sorry, the Steele dossier?
The Steele dossier was entered into our congressional record. Was it true?
There is not a single substantive piece of information in the dossier that has ever been corroborated by the FBI or, to my knowledge, anyone else.
And as we found out from Inspector General Michael Horowitz's report in 2019, Christopher Steele also fingered Sergei Milyan as a dossier source. This was always extremely strange because Steele was super secretive about his supposed dossier sources, yet he had no problem at all telling the FBI that Milyan was the source for almost every dossier allegation. The alleged well-developed conspiracy of cooperation between Trump and Putin, the secret communications channel between Trump and Putin via Alpha Bank, the allegation that Russia passed hacked DNC emails to WikiLeaks, and of course, the P-tape story. All of that supposedly came from Sergei Milyan. And it was all a lie. Sergei Milyan had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. We reported about his story on a previous show, and Milyan's life was completely ruined by Christopher Steele. But was Steele charged with lying to the FBI? No. Unlike Smirnov, Steele got a free pass. And then there's Igor Danchenko. He was Steele's main source, and he too lied to the FBI about Milyan and about various other things. Now, to be fair, he was eventually charged by Special Counsel John Durham in 2022 and ultimately acquitted. That's a story unto itself, but the key point here is that Danchenko's deception started in January of 2017, not in 2022. But instead of charging him in 2017, the FBI made him into a confidential human source. We couldn't believe it when we first heard this a few years ago. The man behind so many Steele dossier lies was rewarded by the FBI with a six-figure salary and confidential human source status. Now, in this case, we do know why this happened. The FBI needed to hide Danchenko from congressional inquiries because he knew too much. Had he been called to testify before Congress in January of 2017, there would have been no Russiagate, there would have been no Mueller, General Michael Flynn would not have been fired, diplomacy with Russia would not have been criminalized, there would have been no Ukraine war, and history would have turned out very differently. The entire fake narrative would have been blown up before it even got started. But because the FBI was dead set on taking down Trump, Danchenko was made a confidential human source despite all the dossier lies. It's really quite unbelievable, but just goes to show how corrupt the FBI is. And the Smirnov case is yet another illustration of that. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and privileged source status for one guy and jail for the other guy. And we haven't even gotten to Stephen Halper. When he lied to the FBI, it was still very early in the scheme of things, and the course of history could have been changed had he not lied, especially as regards the career and fate of General Michael Flynn. Halper, too, was a confidential human source for the FBI, just like Smirnoff. In that role, he was sent to spy on various Trump associates, including Carter Page, George Papadopoulos, and Trump foreign policy coordinator Sam Clovis. Now, most of those conversations were secretly recorded by the FBI, so Halper could not make stuff up. But one conversation was not recorded, and it was Halper who on August 11, 2016, falsely accused a British academic of Russian origin, Svetlana Lokova, of having latched onto General Michael Flynn during an academic conference in Cambridge in England, and then left the event in a cab together with Flynn. So there was no recording, no evidence, just Halper's say-so. And the insinuation, of course, is that Flynn had an affair and that he'd been compromised by a Russian agent. But it was all made up. Not only did it never happen, Halper wasn't even at the event. Svetlana Lokova's life was destroyed by a lie, just like millions was. As for Flynn, the FBI took Halper's story as a pretext to formally start investigating Flynn for Russia collusion. As we reported in July of 2022, a federal judge found that Halper may have made clear misstatements to the FBI and may be responsible for some falsehoods about Michael Flynn and Svetlana Lokova. So where's the indictment of Halper for lying to the FBI? It never came. Like Smirnoff, he was a confidential human source, but unlike Smirnoff, he continues to live the good life, while Smirnoff is in jail. And then there's Rodney Joffe. He was also a source for the FBI. He's the IT executive who was promised a high-ranking post in a Hillary Clinton administration. And he also happens to be behind the Alpha Bank hoax, the elaborate scheme that somehow Donald Trump was secretly communicating with Vladimir Putin via Russia's Alpha Bank. It was all a big lie, but nothing happened to Joffe. So why is it that confidential human sources who say bad stuff about Trump get off scot-free, but the one guy who says something bad about the Bidens is jailed? We all know the answer, although there's still a question mark over why Special Counsel David Wise has decided to bring these charges now. Is he trying to appease his critics after the charges he brought against Hunter Biden? Possibly. We'll probably find out more in the weeks and months ahead. One thing we will find out, which will determine the fate of this story, is whether Smirnoff is going to fight the charges. The charges were brought in the Central District of California, which covers Central and Southern California. So this is not as bad for Smirnoff as having the case brought in Washington, D.C., but it's not exactly great either. If Smirnoff decides to fight these charges, we will find out a lot more about Biden corruption in Ukraine. After all, Smirnoff was in touch with Burisma's top people, and he would want to show that the gist of his story was true, or that he was in fact told the bribe story by someone at Burisma, even if the timing wasn't entirely correct. In short, if Smirnoff fights, a lot of Biden dirt will be aired. If he pleads guilty and makes a deal, we'll probably never find out what really happened. As always, we'll keep a close eye on this story. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.